You call that combat stance? My grandmother could fight better with her eyes closed." The words hit like a physical blow, sharp and deliberate, designed to cut deep. Kira felt them settle into that familiar hollow space in her chest where all the other insults had made their home over the years. She kept her eyes fixed on the training dummy she was repositioning, wooden joints creaking under her grip as she moved it back into place for the next round of elite trainees to demolish. Captain Lydia's voice carried across the royal training grounds with practiced cruelty, her tone pitched just loud enough for everyone to hear, but casual enough to seem like an offhand observation. That was Lydia's particular gift, making her cruelty appear effortless, as natural as breathing. The other trainees laughed on cue, their voices bright with the vicious pleasure of watching someone even lower than themselves get torn apart. Kira had learned long ago not to react. Reaction meant attention, and attention meant more pain. Instead, she focused on the weight of the cloth-wrapped bundle secured against her back, hidden beneath the rough servant's tunic that marked her as one of the expendable ones. The ancient steel pressed against her spine like a secret heartbeat, steady and warm despite the cold morning air that cut across the training grounds with brutal efficiency. The blade had been her mother's, and her mother's mother's before that, passed down through a bloodline that meant nothing to anyone here. Just another piece of worthless metal carried by a worthless girl, or so she let them believe. The truth was something else entirely, something that made her fingers itch to unwrap the weapon and feel its perfect balance in her hands. But that truth was buried beneath years of careful invisibility and practiced powerlessness. "Honestly, I don't know why they even let her on the grounds," Lydia continued, her boots clicking against the stone as she moved through her sword forms with deadly grace. Every movement was precise, lethal, a demonstration of the training that came with noble blood and endless resources. It's not like she's ever going to be anything more than a pack servant. Some people just aren't born for greatness. The other trainees murmured their agreement, their voices a chorus of casual dismissal. Marcus, the Beta's son, actually snorted with amusement. Maybe they keep her around to make the rest of us look better by comparison. Hard to feel inadequate when there's always someone more pathetic nearby. Kira hauled another training dummy into position, her muscles straining against the weight. The physical labour was punishment disguised as duty, a way to keep her busy and remind everyone of her place in the rigid hierarchy that governed their world. At the bottom, always at the bottom, barely worthy of notice except as a target for whatever cruelty needed an outlet. But the blade against her back whispered different truths, ancient ones that spoke of bloodlines and birthright, of power that ran deeper than social standing or political favour. Her mother had died protecting those truths, had spent her last breath making Kira promise to keep the weapon hidden until the time came to reveal what they really were. That time felt as distant as the moon, as impossible as flying, but the blade waited with infinite patience for its moment to sing. "You missed a spot." Lydia's voice was directly behind her now, close enough that Kira could smell the expensive oils used to maintain the captain's weapons, close enough to feel the deliberate intimidation radiating from the other woman's presence like heat from a forge. Kira turned slowly, keeping her movements submissive and her eyes downcast, playing the role that had kept her alive this long. Lydia stood in full training regalia, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. She was beautiful in the way that predators were beautiful, all clean lines and deadly efficiency, bred for violence and groomed for command. The general's daughter, born to rule through fear and raised on the certainty of her own superiority. There. Lydia pointed to a section of the training ground where scattered sand needed to be swept clean. "Make sure you get it properly this time. We can't have the grounds looking sloppy when important people arrive." Important people. The phrase hung in the air between them like a blade waiting to fall. Kira nodded without speaking, knowing that any words would only provide more ammunition for Lydia's cruelty. She moved toward the indicated area, hyper-aware of the wrapped bundle shifting slightly against her back with each step. The other trainees had returned to their practice, but she could feel their attention like pinpricks against her skin. They were waiting for her to stumble, to drop something, to provide them with entertainment in the form of her humiliation. It was a familiar dance, one they had performed countless times with herself as the unwilling star, but today felt different. The blade seemed heavier than usual, more present, as if something in the air had awakened its ancient awareness. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, urgent and desperate in those final moments. "Keep it hidden, my little star. Keep it safe. You'll know when the time comes." The time for what, her mother had never explained. But as Kara swept sand into neat piles and tried to ignore the mocking laughter that followed her every movement, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would change everything, whether she was ready for it or not. The blade pressed against her spine like a promise waiting to be kept, and for the first time in years, Kira wondered if maybe her mother had been right. Maybe she really would know when the time came. Maybe that time was closer than she thought. The transformation began before Seraphina even realized she had chosen to shift. Power erupted from her core like a star going nova, ancient magic that had been sleeping in her bloodline for generations, finally breaking free of the constraints that had held it dormant. But this wasn't the familiar sensation of her wolf emerging. This was something infinitely older, infinitely more dangerous, infinitely more connected to the primal forces that governed the natural world. Her bones didn't crack and reform. They sang. Each shift of cartilage and sinew was accompanied by harmonics that belonged to the deep places of the earth, the kind of sound that preceded earthquakes and avalanches. Silver-white fur erupted across her skin, but it gleamed with its own inner light, each strand seeming to capture and reflect moonbeams that had no business existing in the late afternoon sun. But it was her size that truly marked her as something beyond the normal bounds of lycanthrope genetics. Where her previous wolf form had been impressive, this new shape was massive, easily twice the size of any natural wolf, built on a scale that spoke of creatures from the time when gods walked among mortals and magic was as common as breathing. Scholar Aldrich pressed himself against the far wall of the library, his face pale with reverent terror. "The royal wolf," he whispered, "the form that hasn't been seen since the first Lunar Queen bound the northern territories under her rule." Eleanor's ghostly presence shimmered with approval. Now you understand what they were truly trying to kill. Not just a princess, but the return of power that could reshape the very foundations of their world. Through the mate bond, Seraphina felt Darius's shock wave across the miles that separated them. He was alive, wounded but fighting, and his amazement at feeling her full power awakening sent strength flooding through their connection. Whatever trap had been laid for him, he would survive it. She would make certain of that. The massive wolf that had been Seraphina turned toward the library's windows, and her howl shook the very stones of the ancient castle. It wasn't just sound, it was command, authority, a call that reached into the deepest instincts of every creature within 50 miles and demanded acknowledgement. She leapt through the window in a shower of glass and ancient lead, her powerful form absorbing the impact of a 3-story fall without so much as a stumble. The moment her paws touched earth, every wolf within the compound began howling in response, their voices joining hers in a chorus that spoke of recognition and submission to power beyond their comprehension. But more than wolves answered her call. From the forests that bordered the training grounds, shapes began emerging that belonged to older stories. Bears padded out of their dens with eyes that gleamed with intelligence beyond their species. Great cats descended from rocky outcroppings where they had no business existing in this climate. Ravens gathered in clouds so thick they blotted out portions of the sky, their caws adding a harsh counterpoint to the symphony of howls. The Old One was awake, and with her awakening came the return of bonds that predated human civilization. Seraphina, though she was far more than simply Seraphina now, began to run. Her massive form ate up the miles with supernatural speed, each bound covering distances that should have been impossible. The pack of assembled creatures flowed behind her like a living tide, predators of every description united in their response to royal command. Through the mate bond, she could track Darius's location with the precision of a compass needle pointing toward true north. He was 15 miles to the northeast, trapped in a box canyon where the ambush had been carefully planned to cut off all escape routes. But the attackers had made one crucial miscalculation. They had assumed he would be alone. The first assassins died before they even saw her coming. She crested the ridge overlooking the canyon like a force of nature made manifest, silver-white fur gleaming in the dying light as her howl echoed off the stone walls with the force of divine judgment. Below, she could see Darius in his wolf form, black as midnight and magnificent in his fury, surrounded by a dozen attackers who had been confident in their numerical advantage. Their confidence evaporated the moment they looked up and saw death descending upon them. The royal wolf landed in the centre of their formation with impact that cracked stone, her massive jaws closing around the throat of the nearest assassin before he could even raise his weapon. There was no mercy in her attack, no restraint born of civilized conscience. These creatures had threatened her mate, and for that transgression they would pay with their lives. Ancient power flowed through her movements, lending inhuman speed and strength to strikes that tore through trained warriors like they were made of paper. But more than physical prowess, she wielded authority that reached into the deepest parts of their animal brains and paralyzed them with terror. This wasn't just a large wolf attacking them. This was the apex predator of their nightmares, the creature their species had been designed to flee from since the dawn of time. The surviving assassins broke and ran, their discipline crumbling in the face of supernatural terror. But they didn't get far. The pack that had followed Seraphina from the compound spread out across the canyon like a living net, ensuring that none of her mate's attackers would escape to report back to their masters. Within minutes, it was over. Darius shifted back to human form as she approached, his amber eyes wide with awe and recognition. Blood streaked his skin from multiple wounds, but none appeared life-threatening, testament to his own formidable combat skills and the enhanced healing that came with royal bloodlines. "Seraphina!" he breathed, reaching toward her massive form with hands that trembled slightly. "What have you become?" She couldn't answer in words, not while wearing this shape, but through their bond she let him feel the truth. She was still herself, still the woman who had awakened in his arms and discovered her heritage through his recognition. But she was also something more now, something that connected her to powers and responsibilities that stretched back through centuries of royal bloodline. The transformation back to human form was gentler than the initial shift, ancient magic recognizing that the immediate threat had passed and allowing her to resume a shape more suited to conversation. She stood naked in the canyon, silver-white hair flowing around her shoulders like captured moonlight, her eyes blazing with power that would never fully fade. Darius moved without hesitation, pulling her against his chest and wrapping her in his warmth. Through their bond, she felt his relief, his pride, his overwhelming love for the woman who had just redefined what it meant to be royal. "The noble houses," she said quietly, her voice rough from the howling. "They're behind this, all of it. Elena told me. They killed my mother to prevent the return of the old powers, and now they're trying to kill me for the same reason." "Then they've made their choice," Darius replied, his voice carrying the kind of cold finality that had made him Alpha King. "They want war? They'll have it." Around them, the assembled pack of supernatural creatures waited in perfect stillness, their eyes reflecting the last light of day as they awaited further commands from their newly awakened queen. Bears and wolves, great cats and ravens, all united in their response to power that transcended species boundaries. The old world was returning, whether the noble houses were ready for it or not. And at its heart stood a woman who had spent 20 years learning what it meant to be powerless, now finally understanding what it meant to command forces that could reshape the very foundations of their realm. The lost princess was lost no more. In her place stood the royal wolf, heir to powers that predated civilization and bearer of a crown that no political manoeuvring could take away. The revolution had begun, and it would be written in silver fire and ancient magic. Let the noble houses prepare their armies and marshal their resources. They would discover that some powers were beyond the reach of human ambition, and some bonds were stronger than the fear that drove desperate people to desperate acts. The mate bond pulsed between them like a heartbeat, and in that rhythm Seraphina heard the promise of victory written in their shared blood. The great hall had never seen a gathering quite like this one. Seraphina stood at the centre of the ancient stone chamber, no longer disguised as a servant, but arrayed in the full regalia of her royal heritage. The midnight blue gown that had belonged to her mother fit her perfectly, its silver embroidery catching the torchlight and throwing it back in patterns that seemed to shift and dance with her breathing. The moonblade hung at her side, and upon her head rested the lunar crown, a circlet of silver and moonstone that had been hidden away for 20 years, waiting for its rightful owner to claim it. But it wasn't the crown or the dress that commanded attention. It was the power that radiated from her in waves, ancient magic that made the very air shimmer with barely contained force. Every person in the hall could feel it pressing against their consciousness, a presence that spoke to the deepest parts of their animal nature and demanded acknowledgement. Darius stood beside her, magnificent in his formal robes, but even his overwhelming presence seemed diminished by comparison to the supernatural authority that flowed from his mate. The bond between them blazed like a visible thing, golden threads of connection that made it clear to everyone present that they were witnessing something far beyond political convenience. This was destiny made manifest. The assembled nobility filled the hall, but the mood was far different from the emergency council 3 days earlier. Where before there had been scepticism and outright hostility, now there was careful silence punctuated by whispers of awe and growing recognition. Word of the canyon battle had spread through the compound with lightning speed, carrying with it descriptions of power that belonged to legend rather than reality. General Blackthorn stood with his faction near the eastern wall, his face set in lines of grim determination. But Seraphina could see the fear in his eyes, the dawning understanding that the political manoeuvring he had relied upon for decades was worthless against supernatural forces beyond his comprehension. Lords and ladies of the Northern Territories, Darius began, his voice carrying the absolute authority that had made him Alpha King. We gather today to witness the return of something that was thought lost forever. The rightful heir to the lunar throne stands before you, proven by blood and blade and the acknowledgement of powers older than our civilization. Murmurs rose from the crowd, but they were silenced immediately as Seraphina stepped forward. The moonblade pulsed with silver light at her hip, responding to her movement with the kind of supernatural recognition that no amount of political scheming could counterfeit. 20 years ago, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber, my mother was murdered by those who feared the return of the old ways. They believed that by silencing her voice and hiding her daughter, they could preserve a system built on political convenience rather than rightful inheritance. Her gaze swept across the assembled nobles, lingering on the faces of those she knew had been part of the conspiracy. They were wrong. General Blackthorn stepped forward, his hand resting on his sword hilt in a gesture that walked the line between caution and threat. You speak of murder and conspiracy, But where is your proof beyond the ravings of a mad scholar and the fever dreams of a servant girl who thinks herself princess?" The insult hung in the air like poison, and Seraphina felt her ancient power stir in response to the challenge. But she had learned patience in 20 years of suffering, and she would not waste the opportunity he had just given her. "Proof?" she asked quietly, and her voice carried harmonics that belonged to older, wilder things. "Very well." She drew the moonblade in one fluid motion, the ancient steel singing as it cleared its scabbard. Power radiated from the weapon in waves that made several nobles step backward with gasps of shock, but it was what happened next that sent the entire hall into stunned silence. The blade began to glow, not with reflected torchlight or the subtle luminescence it had shown before, but with pure silver fire that seemed to burn without heat. Runes along the crossguard blazed to life, ancient script that spoke of bloodline and birthright and power passed down through generations of queens. "The moonblade acknowledges only royal blood," she said, holding the weapon aloft so that its light painted the stone walls with shifting patterns of silver and white. "It has burned the hands of every pretender who dared to touch it, every usurper who thought they could claim what was not theirs by right." She turned the blade toward General Blackthorne, its point steady as stone despite the supernatural fire that wreathed its length. "Would you like to test your own claim, General, your own worthiness to question the heritage of queens?" Blackthorne's face had gone pale, but his stubborn pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "Parlour tricks and ancient steel prove nothing. Anyone can claim royal blood if they're desperate enough." "Anyone?" Seraphina smiled, and the expression was sharp enough to cut glass. "Then let them try." She reversed the blade and held it out hilt first, the offer clear and unmistakable. Around the hall, nobles shifted nervously as they realized what she was proposing. The moonblade's legendary properties were well known. It would accept the touch of royal blood, but burn anyone else who dared to grasp it. "Come, General," she said softly, "take the blade. Prove to all assembled that royal blood is nothing more than ancient superstition. Show them that a common-born soldier can wield the weapon of queens." For a long moment Blackthorne stared at the offered weapon, his jaw working as if he were chewing on words too bitter to swallow, but they both knew he couldn't accept her challenge. The moonblade would burn him to ash if he tried to claim it, and everyone in the hall understood that truth. His failure to act was answer enough. "I thought not," Seraphina said, returning the blade to its scabbard with fluid grace. "Perhaps Lord Ironwood would like to test his worthiness, or Lady Ravencrest, any of those who have spent 20 years profiting from a system built on the murder of my mother?" Silence stretched across the hall like a held breath, broken only by the whisper of fabric as nobles shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. None dared to accept her challenge. None could risk the public humiliation of having their false claims exposed before the entire court. "Then let us proceed to more concrete matters," she continued, her voice taking on the kind of deadly calm that preceded storms. "The assassination attempt against the Alpha King 3 days ago. Shall we discuss who might have had the resources to coordinate such an attack?" Through the mate bond, she felt Darius's fierce approval as she began to systematically dismantle the conspiracy that had ruled from the shadows for 2 decades. Every secret she had overheard, every whispered conversation, every midnight meeting, all of it came pouring out in devastating detail that left the guilty parties with nowhere to hide. But it was when she spoke the final accusation that the hall truly erupted. "General Blackthorne," she said, her voice cutting through the rising murmurs like a blade through silk, "would you care to explain why assassins carrying weapons forged in your personal armoury attacked the Alpha King while you were conveniently absent from the compound?" The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the hall turned toward the general, whose face had gone from pale to ashen as the full weight of his exposure settled upon him. "You have no proof," he said desperately, but his voice lacked conviction. "Don't I?" Seraphina reached into her gown and withdrew a small piece of metal, a broken crossbow bolt that bore the distinctive maker's mark of the Blackthorn armories. "This was recovered from the canyon where your assassins attempted to murder my mate. Shall we examine it more closely?" The general's hand moved toward his weapon, desperation finally overcoming caution. But before he could draw steel, the great doors of the hall burst open to admit a figure that sent shockwaves through the assembled nobility. Elena Nightwhisper walked into the hall as if 20 years of death had been nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. Her ghostly form had solidified enough to be visible to all, and power radiated from her presence in ways that made the supernatural atmosphere in the hall even more charged with dangerous energy. "Hello, Blackthorn," she said pleasantly, her voice carrying across the vast chamber with perfect clarity. "I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss." The general stumbled backward, his face white with terror at seeing the woman whose death he had helped to arrange. "You're dead. You died 20 years ago." "Death is more flexible than you might think," Elena replied, her smile sharp as winter wind, "especially when it comes to protecting royal bloodlines from traitorous dogs who bite the hand that feeds them." She turned to address the full assembly, her presence commanding attention in ways that transcended the normal boundaries between life and death. "Lords and ladies of the Northern Court, I am Elena Nightwhisper, captain of Queen Serena's personal guard and guardian of her daughter's heritage. I stand before you today as witness to crimes that have gone unpunished for far too long." Her testimony was devastating in its precision, naming names and revealing details that only someone present at the original conspiracy could have known. The noble houses who had participated in Queen Serena's murder found themselves exposed before their peers with nowhere to hide and no way to deny their involvement. When she finished speaking, the hall was silent except for the harsh breathing of those whose world had just crumbled around them. The old system, built on murder and maintained through intimidation, lay in ruins at their feet. "The time for political games is over," Seraphina said into that silence, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had finally claimed their birthright. "I am Seraphina Nightwhisper, Queen of the Northern Territories by right of blood and birth. Those who would challenge that claim are welcome to face the consequences." She raised the moonblade one final time, its silver fire painting the hall in light that belonged to older, truer powers. "But understand this. The age of shadows and whispered conspiracies is ending. The royal wolf has awakened, and she will no longer allow her people to be ruled by those who mistake cruelty for strength." The blade's light grew brighter, and in its radiance every person in the hall could see the truth written in fire and ancient magic. The lost princess was lost no more, and the kingdom that had been ruled by fear would learn once again what it meant to be governed by those worthy of a crown. The revolution was complete, written in silver light and royal blood, and at its heart stood a queen who had learned her strength in darkness, ready to lead her people into the light. 6 months had passed since the revelation that shattered the old order, and the kingdom had found its rhythm under the rule of those who wore their crowns by right rather than convenience. Seraphina stood on the royal balcony that overlooked the sprawling capital, her hands resting on the stone railing as she watched the evening light paint the city in shades of gold and amber. The crown she wore had become as natural as breathing, no longer the foreign weight it had seemed in those first chaotic weeks after her ascension. Below, the streets bustled with life that spoke of prosperity and peace, merchants closing their stalls after successful days of trade, children playing games that their parents had taught them, couples walking hand in hand through markets that no longer trembled under the threat of political upheaval. This was what she had fought for, what she had almost died for. A kingdom where worth was measured by character rather than bloodline, where power served the people rather than enslaving them. The moonblade hung at her hip, its presence as constant as her heartbeat. But these days it rested easy in its scabbard, no longer needed to prove heritage or defend against assassins. The blade that had once been her secret had become her symbol, displayed openly as a reminder that some truths were stronger than any lie, no matter how carefully crafted. "Lost in thought, my queen?" Darius's voice carried the warmth that had become as familiar as her own reflection, and she turned to find him approaching with the easy grace that marked him as a predator even in his most relaxed moments. 6 months of shared rule had only deepened the bond between them, transforming the desperate recognition of that first day into something richer and more complex. Partnership built on mutual respect, love seasoned with shared trials, desire tempered by the kind of trust that came from facing death together and emerging victorious. "Remembering," she corrected, moving into his arms with the natural ease of long practice. "Thinking about how far we've come." His embrace was warm and solid, an anchor point in a world that had been reshaped by their choices. Through their bond, she could feel his contentment, his pride in what they had built together, his quiet satisfaction at seeing their people thrive under the new order. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, and she could hear the deeper question beneath his words. The path they had chosen hadn't been easy. The trials of the conspirators, the redistribution of lands stolen through generations of political manoeuvring, the delicate work of rebuilding a government based on justice rather than fear. There had been resistance, challenges, moments when it would have been easier to rule through force rather than wisdom. But they had chosen the harder path, and their kingdom was stronger for it. "Oh, only one," she said, tilting her head to meet his eyes. "I regret that it took 20 years for us to find each other." His smile was answer enough, the expression transforming his severe features into something that belonged more to the man who held her in private moments than to the Alpha King who commanded armies. Perhaps that was necessary. Perhaps we needed to become who we are individually before we could become who we are together. It was a thought that had occurred to her many times over the past months. Would she have been strong enough to claim her throne if she hadn't spent 20 years learning what it meant to be powerless? Would she have understood the importance of mercy if she hadn't experienced cruelty? Would she have valued the crown if she hadn't earned it through suffering? The questions had no answers, but they had shaped her understanding of the woman she had become. Not just a queen by blood, but a ruler by choice. Not just powerful, but wise enough to use that power for something greater than personal gain. "The council meeting went well today," Darius said, changing the subject to lighter matters. "Lord Ashford's son has proven remarkably competent as trade minister, despite his family's complicated history." She smiled at the diplomatic understatement. House Ashford had been one of the conspirators, but young William had proven his loyalty through his actions rather than his bloodline. It was a principle they had applied throughout the kingdom, judgment based on character rather than inheritance, opportunity earned through merit rather than birthright. And the eastern border negotiations? Concluded successfully. The coastal clans have agreed to the new territorial arrangements in exchange for expanded trading rights. Everyone gets what they need. No one gets everything they want. His expression grew more serious. There was one other matter discussed. The delegation from the southern kingdoms has requested a formal audience. Seraphina felt her pulse quicken. The southern kingdoms had been watching the northern territories' transformation with interest that bordered on hunger. Their own systems were beginning to show the same cracks that had ultimately destroyed the old order here, and there were whispers that they might be seeking guidance on their own reforms. When? Next month, they're sending their crown prince as an official envoy, along with representatives from 3 of their major houses. Darius's voice carried notes of speculation. "It seems our unconventional approach to governance has attracted attention beyond our borders." "Change has a way of spreading," she mused, thinking of all the kingdoms that still struggled under systems built on fear and maintained through oppression. Perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing. Before he could respond, a new voice interrupted their conversation. "Your Majesties?" They turned to find Captain Sarah Thorne, no relation despite the shared name, approaching with the kind of expression that preceded either very good news or complete disaster. The young woman had risen through the ranks with impressive speed, her loyalty and competence earning her a position as head of the Royal Guard despite her common birth. "What is it, Captain?" Seraphina asked. "The court healer requests your immediate presence in the royal chambers. She says—" The captain paused, a smile threatening to break through her professional composure. "She says there's something you need to know about your condition, Your Majesty." Seraphina's breath caught as understanding dawned. The fatigue she had attributed to the demands of rule, the subtle changes in her body that she had dismissed as stress, the way her supernatural senses had been heightened even beyond their normal acuity, all of it suddenly made perfect sense. Through their bond, she felt Darius's shock mirror her own, followed immediately by a surge of joy so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. An heir, the continuation of both their bloodlines, the promise of a future built on the foundation they had fought so hard to establish. "Thank you, Captain," she managed, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't quite name. "Please inform the healer we'll be there shortly." When they were alone again, Darius pulled her close, his hands gentle as they settled over her still flat abdomen. "A child," he said wonderingly. "Our child." "The first of a new generation," she agreed, covering his hands with her own. "One that will grow up in a world where worth isn't determined by the circumstances of birth, but by the choices made along the way." They stood together in the gathering twilight, watching the lights begin to twinkle in the city below as families settled in for the evening. Somewhere in those homes, children were learning the stories that would shape their understanding of the world. Tales of the lost princess who reclaimed her throne, of the Alpha King who chose love over political convenience, of the revolution that proved some bonds were stronger than fear. "What do you think they'll say about us?" Seraphina asked quietly. "Generations from now, when this is all just history and legend?" Darius considered the question seriously, his amber eyes reflecting the last light of day. "I think they'll say we were two people who found each other when we needed it most, who chose to build something better than what we inherited, who proved that sometimes the greatest strength comes from admitting you were wrong and choosing to change." It was a legacy she could live with, a story worth telling. In the distance, wolves began their evening song, voices raised in harmony that spoke of pack bonds and territorial claims, and the ancient rhythms that governed life in the wild places. But tonight their howls carried a different note. Contentment, security, the sound of creatures who knew they were protected by those strong enough to guard them, and wise enough to rule with justice rather than fear. Seraphina listened to their song and smiled, her hand moving to rest over the new life growing within her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to prove that the path they had chosen was the right one. But tonight, standing in the arms of her mate with their child growing beneath her heart and their kingdom prospering below, she allowed herself to simply be grateful. She had been nobody for 20 years, invisible and powerless, and told she was worthless at every turn. But love had seen her when she couldn't see herself. Destiny had called her name when she had forgotten it belonged to her, and in the end she had discovered that the greatest victory wasn't claiming a throne or wielding supernatural power. It was choosing to become someone worthy of the love she had been given and the crown she had finally learned to wear with grace. The lost princess was found at last, not in the revelation of her bloodline, but in the moment she decided to stop running from who she was meant to be. And that, she thought, as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, was the only story that truly mattered. The morning air carried the scent of change long before anyone saw him coming. Kira felt it first as a ripple of unease that started in her chest and spread outward like rings on disturbed water. The blade against her back grew warm, responding to something her conscious mind couldn't identify yet. She paused in her sweeping, sand scattering from her broom as an inexplicable tension seized her muscles. Then the wolves began to howl. The sound started low and distant, rising from the forest that bordered the eastern edge of the training grounds. One voice became two, then five, then a chorus that sent ice through every nerve ending. It wasn't the howl of hunting or territory marking, this was something else entirely. Recognition, submission, welcome. "What in the seven hells?" Marcus dropped his practice sword, the metal clanging against stone as he turned toward the sound. Every trainee on the grounds had frozen mid-motion, their faces reflecting the same confusion and growing alarm. Lydia's hand moved instinctively to her weapon, her body shifting into a combat stance even as her eyes scanned the tree line. "Form up!" she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone born to lead in crisis. "Defensive positions, now!" But Kira couldn't move. The warmth from the blade had spread through her entire body, and with it came a certainty that defied logic. Whatever was coming wasn't a threat. It was something far more dangerous than that. It was destiny. The ground trembled under the weight of approaching horses, and then he appeared at the edge of the training grounds like something out of legend. The Alpha King rode a midnight black stallion that moved with predatory grace, its eyes gleaming with intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. Behind him came an honor guard of 20 warriors, each one radiating the kind of lethal competence that came from surviving countless battles. But all of that faded into insignificance the moment Kira laid eyes on the Alpha King himself. He was massive, built like a force of nature given human form. His dark hair was pulled back from a face that could have been carved from granite, all sharp angles and hard lines softened only by eyes the colour of ancient amber. Power radiated from him in waves that made the air itself seem to vibrate, a presence so overwhelming that every person on the training grounds took an instinctive step backward, every person except Kira. She stood frozen in place, broom forgotten in her hands, as those amber eyes swept across the assembled trainees with casual assessment. This was the ruler of the Northern Territories, the Alpha King whose very name could silence rebellions and whose word was law across half the continent. He could kill everyone present without breaking a sweat, and no one would dare question his reasons. The trainees arranged themselves automatically in order of rank, noble blood drawing them toward the front, while lesser families fell back in carefully observed hierarchy. Lydia stepped forward as the highest-ranking person present, her spine straight and her chin lifted with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. "Your Majesty," she said, executing a perfect formal bow, "we were not expecting an inspection today. Please forgive our informal state." The Alpha King's gaze moved over her with polite disinterest, acknowledging her greeting with a slight nod before continuing his survey of the grounds. His horse pawed the earth restlessly, nostrils flaring as it scented the air with obvious agitation. The other mounts were showing similar signs of unease, their ears swivelling and their eyes rolling white at the edges. Something was making them nervous. Kira tried to step backward, to fade into invisibility the way she always did when authority figures appeared, but her feet might as well have been rooted to the ground. The blade against her back was almost burning now, its ancient metal responding to the Alpha King's presence with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. She needed to get away, needed to hide, needed to... The wrapped bundle slipped. It happened so quickly that she almost caught it, almost managed to grab the cloth before it could fall completely. But her fingers, made clumsy by panic and the strange energy coursing through her body, couldn't quite grasp the fabric in time. The bundle hit the ground with a soft thump that seemed to echo across the suddenly silent training grounds. The Alpha King's head snapped toward the sound with predatory precision, those amber eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. His horse whinnied and shied sideways, responding to some signal she couldn't interpret, while the wolves in the forest renewed their howling with renewed fervour. Kira dropped to her knees immediately, scrambling to rewrap the blade before anyone could see what lay beneath the rough cloth. But her hands were shaking now, trembling with a mixture of terror and something else, something that felt suspiciously like recognition. The fabric seemed to fight her efforts, determined to fall away and reveal the ancient steel hidden beneath. "Stop!" The command cut through the air like a physical force, freezing every person on the training grounds in place. The Alpha King's voice carried the kind of absolute authority that made disobedience literally impossible, a power that reached past conscious thought and seized control of motor functions. Kira's hands stilled on the half-wrapped bundle, her heart hammering against her ribs as footsteps approached with measured deliberation. She could see the Alpha King's boots from her position on the ground, expensive leather that had been crafted by master artisans and worn by someone accustomed to walking over anything that stood in his way. "Look at me." The words weren't spoken loudly, but they carried a weight that made the very air around her seem to thicken. Slowly, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to remain invisible, Kira raised her eyes to meet his gaze. The world tilted. Something passed between them in that moment, something that had nothing to do with words or conscious thought. His pupils dilated with shock while her breath caught in her throat, and for one impossible instant she could swear she felt something inside her chest reach toward him with desperate longing. The Alpha King took a step back, his face going carefully blank in the way that powerful men did when confronted with the unexpected. But his horse was dancing sideways now, responding to its rider's emotional state with increasing agitation, and the other mounts were beginning to mirror the behaviour. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice rougher than it had been moments before. "Kira," she whispered, hating how small and broken her voice sounded. "Kira Thorne, Your Majesty." "And what," he said, his eyes dropping to the partially wrapped bundle in her hands, "is that?" Panic clawed at her throat. There was no good answer to that question, no explanation that wouldn't lead to more dangerous inquiries. The blade was hers by right of inheritance, but inheritance from whom? A mother who had died in circumstances she barely remembered, leaving behind only cryptic warnings about keeping secrets. She began, then stopped. The lie died on her lips as those amber eyes bored into hers with supernatural intensity. Something about his presence made deception feel impossible, as if he could see straight through to her soul and catalogue every hidden truth. "It's nothing," she finally managed, "just old metal, family piece, worthless." The Alpha King's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around him. His horse stamped and snorted, while in the distance the wolf song rose to an almost frenzied pitch. Whatever they were responding to, it was getting stronger. "Show me," he commanded. Kira's hands moved without her conscious permission, unwrapping the cloth with trembling fingers. The ancient steel revealed itself inch by inch, its surface gleaming with a light that seemed to come from within the metal itself. Runes etched along the blade's edge caught the morning sun and threw it back in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The reaction was immediate and undeniable. The Alpha King's breath hissed between his teeth, while his horse reared backward with a scream of pure terror. Every trainee on the grounds gasped in unison, their faces pale with shock and dawning recognition. Because this wasn't just any blade. This was legend made manifest, myth given physical form. This was the Lunar Queen's sword, thought lost for over 20 years. And somehow, impossibly, it was in the hands of a servant girl who shouldn't have existed. Silence stretched across the training grounds like a held breath, broken only by the restless stamping of horses and the distant howling that had not ceased since the Alpha King's arrival. Every eye was fixed on the blade in Kira's trembling hands, the ancient steel catching morning light and throwing it back in patterns that seemed to shift and dance with their own inner fire. The Alpha King dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the ground with the controlled grace of a predator. His amber eyes never left the weapon as he approached, each step measured and deliberate. The very air around him seemed to thicken with barely contained power, making it difficult to breathe. "Where did you get this?" His voice was deadly quiet, the kind of soft tone that preceded violence. Kira's throat closed. She could feel the weight of everyone's stares, the shock and growing hostility radiating from the noble trainees who had spent their lives believing in the natural order of things. A servant girl holding the lost Lunar Queen's blade was an impossibility that threatened the very foundation of their world. She began, then stopped. The truth was too dangerous, too impossible. But lies seemed equally fatal when faced with those penetrating amber eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "It belonged to my mother," she whispered finally. She died when I was small." Marcus let out a harsh laugh from somewhere behind her. "Your mother was a pack servant girl. How would she come to possess the Lunar Queen's personal weapon?" The accusation hung in the air like poison, and Kira could feel the mood of the crowd shifting from shock to anger. These were people who had been raised on stories of the lost Lunar Queen, taught to revere her memory as a symbol of everything noble and pure about their kind. To suggest that a servant could have any legitimate claim to her most sacred relic was tantamount to blasphemy. "She stole it!" Lydia's voice cut through the tension like a blade. The general's daughter stepped forward, her hand resting on her own weapon with casual threat. "It's the only explanation. No doubt pilfered from some noble house during the chaos after the Lunar Queen's death." Murmurs of agreement rose from the assembled trainees. The accusation made sense, fit neatly into their understanding of how the world worked. Servants stole, nobles owned. The natural order maintained itself through such simple truths. But the Alpha King held up a hand for silence, his gaze still locked on the blade in Kira's grip. Something in his expression had changed, a subtle shift that spoke of recognition dawning like a terrible sunrise. "The Moonblade," he said softly, naming the weapon for what it truly was. "Forged in the old times when the bond between human and wolf was still sacred. They said it could only be wielded by those of royal blood, that it would burn the hands of anyone else who dared to touch it." He reached out slowly, his fingers hovering inches from the crossguard. The metal seemed to pulse in response to his proximity, the runes along its edge flaring with silver light that made several trainees step backward with sharp intakes of breath. "May I?" he asked, and there was something almost reverent in his tone. Kira nodded, not trusting her voice. She watched as his fingers closed around the hilt, bracing herself for the weapon to burn him, as legend claimed it would burn all those unworthy of its power. Instead, the blade sang. The sound was barely audible, more felt than heard, a harmonic vibration that seemed to resonate in the bones. Light travelled up the steel like liquid silver, and for a moment the Alpha King's eyes blazed with supernatural fire as ancient magic recognized ancient bloodline. But then his expression changed. Shock gave way to confusion. Confusion to something that looked almost like pain. He released the hilt as if it had suddenly become too hot to touch, though no burns marked his skin. "Impossible," he breathed. The blade continued to pulse with silver light even without his touch, responding to something else entirely. Kira looked down at her own hands where they still gripped the weapon and gasped. Her skin was unmarked, unblistered, as if the Moonblade's legendary fire was nothing more than a warm breeze against her flesh. "The legends say," Marcus began, then stopped. His face had gone pale with dawning understanding. The legends say it burns all who are not of royal blood, the Alpha King finished, his voice hollow with implications. He looked at Kira as if seeing her for the first time, taking in her rough servant's clothing, her calloused hands, the dirt under her fingernails from a lifetime of menial labour. "But that's impossible," Lydia snarled, her composure finally cracking. "She's nobody. A pack servant with no bloodline, no heritage, no claim to anything beyond what scraps we choose to throw her way." The Alpha King's wolf chose that moment to respond, a low rumble emanating from his chest that spoke of recognition on levels deeper than conscious thought. His human mind might struggle to accept what his eyes were showing him, but his wolf knew truth when it encountered it. Royal blood called to royal blood, always had, always would. "Show me your neck," he commanded suddenly. "Your Majesty?" Kira's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Your neck, show me." With trembling fingers, she pulled aside the rough fabric of her servant's tunic, revealing the pale column of her throat. There, just below her left ear, lay a birthmark she had carried since childhood. Crescent-shaped, silver-pale against her skin, it had always seemed like nothing more than a quirk of genetics. The Alpha King's breath hissed between his teeth. "The lunar mark," he said, naming what she had never known she bore. The sign of the royal bloodline, passed from mother to daughter for 1,000 years. The training grounds erupted in chaos. Voices rose in denial and accusation, while others whispered prayers to ancient gods. But through it all, Kira heard only the Alpha King's voice, rough with emotions she couldn't identify. "What was your mother's name?" "Elena," she whispered. "Elena Thorne." "And before she was Thorne?" Kira shook her head helplessly. "I don't know. She never spoke of her life before I was born. She said the past was buried for good reason." The Alpha King stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him putting pieces together, following threads of memory and legend to their inevitable conclusion. When he spoke again, his words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through everyone present. "Elena Night Whisper," he said, "captain of the Lunar Queen's personal guard. She vanished the night Queen Serena was murdered, along with the Queen's infant daughter. They searched for months, but it was as if both had simply disappeared from the world." The implications hit like physical blows. If Elena Night Whisper had been the Lunar Queen's guard captain, and if she had vanished with the Queen's daughter, and if that daughter had somehow survived— "No," Lydia's voice was sharp with panic. "No, that's not possible. The princess died with her mother. Everyone knows that." But the Alpha King was studying Kira's face with the intensity of someone seeing a ghost. "You have her eyes," he said softly. "Serena's eyes. I should have seen it immediately." Kira felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The princess, the lost heir to the Northern throne, the child whose death had plunged the kingdom into chaos and civil war. She was supposedly looking at herself. "I'm nobody," she said desperately, the words tumbling out like a prayer or a curse. I clean the training grounds. I tend the fires. I'm nothing." "You're everything," the Alpha King replied, and his voice carried a weight that seemed to press against her chest. "You're the rightful queen of the Northern Territories. You're the lost princess we've mourned for 20 years. The moonblade pulsed in her hands like a living thing, its silver light growing brighter, as if responding to the truth finally being spoken aloud. Around her, the world seemed to shift and realign, social hierarchies crumbling as a new and terrible reality took their place. She wasn't the worthless servant they had all believed her to be. She was the crown princess of the realm, heir to a throne that had stood empty since her supposed death. And judging by the expression on the Alpha King's face, that revelation was about to change everything. The silence that followed the Alpha King's pronouncement stretched like a bowstring, pulled to its breaking point. Kira could feel the weight of dozens of stares, the shock and disbelief radiating from everyone present like heat from a forge. But beneath it all, she sensed something else. Fear, raw, primal terror at the implications of what they had just witnessed. "Clear the grounds," the Alpha King commanded, his voice cutting through the tension with absolute authority. "Now." The trainees scattered like leaves before a storm, their voices rising in urgent whispers as they fled toward the compound. Only Lydia remained, her face pale with something that looked suspiciously like panic. "Your Majesty," she began, her usual composure cracking around the edges. "Surely this is some mistake. The princess died 20 years ago. Everyone knows—" "Everyone knows what they were told to know," the Alpha King cut her off, his amber eyes blazing with something dangerous. "Leave us. Tell your father I'll speak with him later about security arrangements." It was a dismissal that brooked no argument, delivered with the kind of quiet menace that made disobedience suicidal. Lydia's jaw tightened, but she executed a stiff bow and stalked away, her shoulders rigid with barely contained fury. When they were alone, the Alpha King turned back to Kira, who stood frozen in place with the moonblade still pulsing silver light in her trembling hands. The weapon seemed heavier now, weighted with revelations she couldn't begin to process. "Come," he said, his voice gentler than it had been moments before. "We need to talk, privately." He led her to a secluded training chamber at the far end of the complex, a small stone room used for private instruction and meditation. Ancient tapestries covered the walls, their faded threads depicting battles and ceremonies from ages past. The air smelled of old leather and sword oil, familiar scents that somehow made her feel safer despite the chaos of the last few minutes. The Alpha King closed the door behind them and activated privacy wards with a gesture, his fingers tracing patterns in the air that glowed briefly before fading. Whatever they discussed here would remain between them, protected by magic older than memory. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a wooden bench along one wall. Kira perched on the edge of the seat, the moonblade across her knees like a bridge between her old life and whatever lay ahead. The Alpha King studied her for a long moment, and she could see him cataloguing details, the shape of her face, the colour of her eyes, the way she carried herself despite years of systematic degradation. "Tell me about your mother," he said finally. "Everything you remember." "She died when I was 7, Kira began hesitantly. "Fever, they said, but before she—" She swallowed hard, the memories still painful after all these years. "She made me promise to keep the blade hidden, said I'd know when the time came to reveal it." "What else did she tell you?" "That my father was a good man who died protecting what he loved, that some secrets were kept to protect the living, not to honour the dead, and that I should never, ever tell anyone my real name." The Alpha King leaned forward, his attention sharpening to laser focus. "Your real name?" Kira's hands tightened on the blade's hilt, and the weapon pulsed with renewed light. "Seraphina," she whispered. "She called me Seraphina when we were alone, said it meant burning one, and that someday I would understand why." The Alpha King's breath caught. "Seraphina Night Whisper, the lost princess. Queen Serena named you for the fire she said burned in your eyes from the moment of your birth." The words hit her like physical blows, each one reshaping her understanding of who she was and where she came from. The little girl who had grown up believing she was nobody, worth nothing, had actually been born to rule a kingdom. "I don't understand," she said desperately. "If I'm truly the princess, then why was I left here? Why didn't anyone come for me?" Pain flickered across the Alpha King's features. "Because we thought you were dead. The night your mother was murdered, assassins attacked the royal quarters. When dawn came, we found Queen Serena's body, but yours was never recovered. We hoped you had died quickly rather than—" He didn't finish the sentence, but she could guess what horrors he had imagined. "Elena, your mother's guard captain, vanished the same night. We searched everywhere, followed every lead, but it was as if she had simply disappeared from the world. Now I understand. She didn't abandon her post. She was following the last order her queen ever gave her. Protect the princess at all costs." Kira closed her eyes, trying to reconcile the mother she remembered. Tired, worn down by years of menial labour and constant vigilance, with the elite warrior he described. But pieces were falling into place now, small details that had never made sense before taking on new meaning. "She used to have nightmares," Kira said softly, "about failing someone she called my lady, and sometimes she would practice sword forms when she thought I was asleep, moving like dancing with death." "Elena was the finest warrior I ever knew," the Alpha King said quietly. "Your mother trained her personally, and she would have died before letting harm come to you. The fact that she kept you hidden for 20 years kept you safe." His voice trailed off, thick with emotions she couldn't identify. "But I'm not safe now," Kira said, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. "If there are people who killed my mother, my birth mother, then they'll want to kill me too." The Alpha King's expression darkened. "Which is why we need to discuss what happens next. You can't remain here, not after today's revelation. Too many people heard too much. Word will spread, and when it does—" He reached out suddenly, his fingers brushing against hers where they gripped the Moonblade's hilt. The contact sent electricity racing up her arm, and for one impossible moment she felt something else. A presence that wasn't quite her own, stirring deep in her chest. Her wolf. The realization hit her like a thunderbolt. She had a wolf. After 20 years of believing herself broken, defective, she could feel the ancient spirit uncoiling within her like a flower opening to sunlight. And more than that, her wolf was responding to his proximity with a recognition that transcended conscious thought. The Alpha King felt it too. She could see it in the way his pupils dilated, the subtle tension that suddenly gripped his powerful frame. His own wolf was calling out to hers, ancient instincts recognizing what his human mind was still struggling to accept. Mate. The word whispered through her consciousness like a prayer or a curse, and she jerked her hand away from his as if burned. The contact broke, but the awareness remained, thrumming between them like a live wire. "This is impossible," she breathed. "Many things are impossible," the Alpha King replied, his voice rough with barely controlled emotion. "That doesn't make them untrue." They stared at each other across the small space, both struggling to process revelations that threatened to upend everything they thought they knew about themselves and their world. Princess and Alpha King, lost heir and ruler of the most powerful pack in the Northern Territories. Destined mates, if the ancient magic coursing through the Moonblade was to be believed. "What's your name?" Kira asked suddenly. "Your real name, not your title." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Darius. Darius Shadowmere, son of the Northern Wind and heir to storms." "Darius," she repeated, tasting the name like wine. It fit him, strong and dangerous and touched with wild magic. "And you are Seraphina Night Whisper," he said in return. "The burning crown, rightful queen of the Northern Territories, the woman my wolf has been searching for since the day I first shifted." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Too much had changed too quickly, too many impossible truths revealed in the span of a single morning. But the Moonblade continued to pulse with silver light, ancient magic recognizing what their hearts were only beginning to understand. They were bound now, connected by forces older and stronger than politics or social convention. The lost princess and the Alpha King, brought together by fate and sealed by recognition that transcended the barriers humans like to imagine, separated them from their wolves. Whatever came next, they would face it together, whether they were ready or not. Lydia Blackthorne had always prided herself on her ability to read the currents of power, to sense when the political winds were shifting and position herself accordingly. It was a skill that had served her well in the brutal hierarchy of pack politics, allowing her to climb from general's daughter to heir apparent of one of the most influential bloodlines in the Northern Territories. But as she stalked through the corridors of the training compound, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, she felt that carefully cultivated control slipping away like sand through her fingers. The servant girl. The worthless, pathetic nobody who cleaned the training grounds and accepted abuse without complaint. She was the lost princess. The rightful heir to the northern throne. The woman who could destroy everything Lydia had spent her life building. The woman the Alpha King's wolf had recognized. Captain Blackthorne. The voice belonged to Marcus Ironwood, the Beta's son, and one of the few trainees who could claim bloodlines nearly as pure as her own. He fell into step beside her, his face pale with the same shock that had gripped everyone present during the morning's revelation. "Did you see the way he looked at her?" Marcus continued, his voice low and urgent. The Alpha King, his wolf, it was responding to her, not just as royalty, but as— "Don't say it," Lydia cut him off sharply. The implications were too dangerous to voice aloud, too catastrophic to acknowledge even in whispers. But she had seen it too, the unmistakable signs of supernatural recognition passing between the two most powerful bloodlines in their world. If the Alpha King's wolf had claimed the lost princess as mate, then every political arrangement, every carefully negotiated alliance, every plan for the future would crumble to ash. Including her own engagement to the Alpha King, scheduled to be announced at the summer solstice in less than 3 months. "We have to do something," Marcus said desperately. "My father, your father, all the noble houses who have supported the current arrangement, they won't stand for this. They can't. Too much depends on the political alliance your marriage would create." Lydia's mind raced through possibilities, cataloguing assets and vulnerabilities with the cold efficiency her father had drilled into her since childhood. General Blackthorne commanded the loyalty of half the northern armies. The Ironwood family controlled the eastern trade routes. Together, their coalition represented enough military and economic power to challenge even an Alpha King's authority. But only if they acted quickly, before the lost princess could consolidate her position, or the mate bond could fully manifest. "Where is she now?" Lydia asked. "Still in the private chamber with the Alpha King. They've been in there for over an hour." An hour. More than enough time for a mate bond to solidify, for political realities to shift beyond repair. Lydia's jaw tightened with determination, born of desperation. She had not clawed her way to the top of the pack hierarchy, only to be displaced by a girl who had spent 20 years scrubbing floors. "Gather the others," she commanded, quietly. "Tell them to meet in the Eastern Armory after evening meal. And send word to my father. Tell him we need to discuss security concerns regarding the recent revelations." Marcus nodded and hurried away, understanding flickering in his eyes. They were moving into dangerous territory now, the kind of political manoeuvring that could be construed as treason if it went wrong. But the alternative, accepting the lost princess's claim and watching their own power evaporate, was unthinkable. Lydia continued her path through the compound until she reached the chambers assigned to visiting dignitaries, where the Alpha King's honour guard had taken up residence. The warriors lounged in the common area with the casual alertness of predators at rest, their weapons within easy reach and their eyes tracking her movement with professional interest. She paused at the threshold, projecting the confident authority that was her birthright. These men served the Alpha King with absolute loyalty, but they also understood the political realities of pack leadership. A word in the right ear, a suggestion planted with surgical precision, could accomplish more than direct confrontation. "Commander Thane," she said, addressing the grizzled veteran who led the Alpha King's personal guard, "I trust His Majesty's meeting is proceeding satisfactorily?" The commander's weathered face revealed nothing, but she caught the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested he was as unsettled by the day's events as everyone else. "His Majesty conducts his affairs as he sees fit, Captain Blackthorne." "Of course," she replied smoothly, "though I confess concern about the security implications of today's revelation. A lost princess suddenly appearing after 20 years of presumed death. It raises questions about who might have been responsible for keeping her hidden, and why they chose this moment to reveal themselves. It was a masterful insinuation, planting seeds of doubt about the princess's supporters while positioning herself as concerned with the Alpha King's safety. Commander Thane was too experienced to rise to such obvious bait, but she saw the flicker of consideration in his eyes. "The Alpha King is quite capable of protecting himself," he said carefully. Indeed, though one wonders about the timing. 3 months before his announced engagement, a mysterious princess appears with convenient proof of her bloodline. It almost seems orchestrated. She let the implication hang in the air like poison, watching as the commander processed her words. The suggestion that the lost princess's appearance might be part of some larger conspiracy was exactly the kind of paranoid thinking that would appeal to a man whose job was preventing assassination attempts. "Thank you for your concern, Captain," he said finally. "I'll be sure to remain vigilant." Lydia smiled, the expression sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm sure you will. The Alpha King's safety is paramount after all. We can't have him making decisions based on emotional manipulation." She withdrew before the commander could respond, satisfied that she had planted the necessary doubts. By evening, word would spread through the honour guard that the lost princess's appearance might not be as innocent as it seemed. Suspicion would breed caution, caution would breed delay, and delay would give her the time she needed to organise proper resistance. But first, she needed to deal with the immediate threat. The lost princess might have royal blood and an ancient sword, but she was still the same frightened girl who had spent 20 years accepting abuse without fighting back. 20 years of learned helplessness couldn't be overcome in a single afternoon, no matter what supernatural recognition might have passed between her and the Alpha King. All it would take was the right pressure applied at the right moment, and the problem would resolve itself permanently. Lydia made her way to the servants' quarters, where a handful of gold coins and whispered threats could purchase the kind of accident that befell clumsy girls who ventured into dangerous areas after dark. The training compound was full of hazards for the unwary: loose stones on high walkways, improperly secured weapons that might fall from their racks, wild beasts that sometimes wandered in from the forest. So many ways for a servant girl to meet an unfortunate end, even one who had recently discovered she was supposedly a princess, especially one who threatened everything Lydia held dear. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson that reminded her unpleasantly of the Alpha King's eyes. But by tomorrow's dawn, those eyes would no longer hold the promise of a mate bond that could destroy her future. The lost princess had survived 20 years in hiding, but she would not survive her first day in the light. Lydia would make certain of that. The attack came at sunset, when the training grounds lay empty and the shadows grew long enough to hide predators. Kira had been walking the familiar path between the servants' quarters and the main compound, her mind still reeling from the revelations of the day. Princess, mate, destiny. The words tumbled through her consciousness like stones in a landslide, each one carrying enough weight to reshape her understanding of everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in the world. The moonblade hung at her side now, no longer hidden beneath rough cloth, but secured in a proper scabbard that Darius had provided. The weight of it felt strange against her hip, foreign and familiar all at once, as if some part of her had always known it belonged there. She should have been more careful, should have remembered that revealing her identity would paint a target on her back the size of a kingdom. But 20 years of invisibility had made her careless about her own safety, and she was still thinking like a servant girl who posed no threat to anyone. That almost got her killed. They came from 3 directions at once, moving with the coordinated precision of a pack hunt. Marcus Ironwood emerged from behind the stables, a training sword in his hand and murder in his eyes. 2 other noble trainees flanked him, Garrett Stonewood and Alan Ravencrest, both sons of influential families with everything to lose if the political order shifted. Well, well, Marcus said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty that Kira had endured for years. If it isn't our newly discovered princess. Tell me, Your Majesty, how does it feel to know that your reign will be measured in hours rather than years? Kira's hand moved instinctively toward the Moonblade's hilt, but Garrett was already closing from her left, his own weapon raised in a strike that would have taken her head if she hadn't thrown herself sideways at the last second. Steel whistled through empty air where her neck had been moments before. "Careful," Alan called out with mock concern. "We're supposed to make this look like an accident, remember? Training mishap. Poor girl got caught in the crossfire of an advanced combat exercise." They spread out in a loose triangle, cutting off her escape routes with the efficiency of hunters who had planned this carefully. These weren't the random bullying sessions she was accustomed to. This was execution disguised as sport, and she was the prey. Terror flooded her system, the same paralyzing fear that had kept her compliant and invisible for 20 years. But beneath it, something else was stirring, something that had been sleeping in her blood since birth, waiting for the moment when survival demanded more than submission. Her wolf. "You can't do this," she said, backing toward the only gap in their formation. A narrow space between Marcus and Garrett that would require perfect timing to exploit. "The Alpha King isn't here," Marcus cut her off with a laugh. "Called away on urgent business, just like we planned. By the time he returns, you'll be nothing more than a tragic footnote in pack history, the lost princess who died in a training accident on the very day she was found." They attacked simultaneously, 3 blades converging on her position from different angles. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, nothing to do but fight. The Moonblade sang as it cleared its scabbard, ancient steel moving with liquid grace as Kira's body responded to instincts she had never known she possessed. The first parry deflected Marcus's thrust, sending his blade skittering off hers in a shower of sparks. The second turned Garrett's overhead strike into a glancing blow that barely missed her shoulder. But she wasn't fast enough for all of them. Alan's sword took her across the ribs, opening a line of fire that sent blood streaming down her side. Pain lanced through her consciousness, sharp and immediate, but instead of weakening her, it seemed to awaken something that had been dormant for too long. Power. It flooded through her veins like liquid lightning, ancient and wild and utterly intoxicating. Her vision sharpened until she could see every detail of her attacker's movements, every tell that betrayed their next strike. Her muscles sang with strength that had nothing to do with human physiology and everything to do with the supernatural heritage flowing in her blood. The next exchange was different. Her blade moved with inhuman speed, weaving patterns in the air that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Marcus's confident expression cracked as his sword was torn from his grip by a strike that should have been impossible for someone of her size and training. "What the hell?" he began, then stopped as golden light began to emanate from Kira's skin. Her wolf was rising. She could feel it uncoiling in her chest like a caged storm finally set free, wild and fierce and absolutely without mercy for those who threatened her survival. Power radiated from her in waves that made the very air shimmer with heat, and when she looked at her attackers, they stepped back with dawning terror in their eyes. "You want to know what it feels like to be a princess?" she asked, and her voice carried harmonics that had nothing to do with human vocal cords. "Let me show you." The transformation hit like an avalanche of sensation, bones cracking and reforming as ancient magic reshaped her human frame into something altogether more primal. But unlike the agonizing shifts described in old stories, this felt like coming home after a lifetime of exile. Her wolf didn't fight to emerge. It flowed into existence with the natural grace of water finding its level. Silver-white fur rippled across skin that glowed with supernatural fire. Eyes that had been human brown blazed gold with royal power, and when she bared her teeth, they were no longer the dull weapons of an omnivore, but the razor-sharp fangs of an apex predator. The moonblade remained in her grip, or rather clenched in jaws that could crush steel, as she faced her attackers in her true form. They had expected to murder a helpless servant girl. Instead, they found themselves confronting a royal wolf, whose bloodline could be traced back to the first packs that had claimed dominion over the Northern Territories. Garrett broke first, throwing down his weapon and fleeing toward the compound with a scream that carried notes of pure terror. Alan followed a heartbeat later, his face white with shock as he scrambled away from the supernatural predator he had tried to kill. But Marcus held his ground, his hand fumbling for a dagger at his belt, with the desperate determination of someone who understood that retreat would only delay the inevitable. "You're an abomination," he snarled, fear and hatred warring in his voice. "A freak of nature that should have died with her mother 20 years ago." Kira's wolf considered him with the patient interest of a predator studying prey. She could kill him easily. One snap of her jaws would crush his spine, one swipe of her claws would open his throat. It would be justice for the years of torment, revenge for the attempt on her life. But Elena Nightwhisper had raised her daughter to be better than that. Instead of killing him, she shifted back to human form in a cascade of golden light, the moonblade returning to her hand as if it had never left. Blood still streamed from the wound in her side, but it was already beginning to close with supernatural healing that marked her royal bloodline. "Run," she said quietly, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had just remembered she was born to command. "Run, and tell whoever sent you that the lost princess is lost no more. I am Seraphina Nightwhisper, daughter of Queen Serena, rightful heir to the Northern Throne, and I am done hiding." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, fear, and grudging respect. Then he turned and fled, leaving her alone in the gathering darkness with the taste of power on her tongue and the knowledge that everything had changed. She was no longer the girl who accepted abuse without fighting back. She was a wolf who had found her teeth, and she intended to use them. Darius felt the moment her wolf awakened from 3 miles away. The sensation hit him like a physical blow, a surge of recognition that nearly sent him to his knees in the middle of negotiating a territorial dispute with the Eastern Pack leaders. Ancient magic called to ancient magic, royal bloodline to royal bloodline, and his wolf responded with a howl that escaped his throat before he could stop it. Every wolf in the meeting hall went silent, their eyes wide with shock at the Alpha King's loss of control. But Darius barely noticed their stares. His entire being was focused on the golden thread that had just snapped taut between himself and someone back at the training compound. His mate had found her power. "The meeting is adjourned," he said, his voice rough with barely contained urgency. "Commander Thane, prepare to ride, now." He didn't wait for acknowledgement, couldn't spare the time for explanations or political niceties. The bond that had been fragile and tentative that morning was now blazing like a star gone nova, and with it came sensations that made his blood run cold. Pain, fear, the metallic taste of violence. She was in danger. The ride back to the compound took an eternity that lasted exactly 47 minutes. His horse thundered through the forest paths with supernatural speed, responding to its rider's urgency with the loyalty that bound all creatures to the Alpha King's will. Behind him, his honour guards struggled to keep pace, their mounts foam-flecked and heaving as they pushed toward whatever crisis awaited them. But even as they crested the final hill and the training compound came into view, Darius could feel that the immediate danger had passed. The bond between them hummed with something new, not pain or fear, but a fierce satisfaction that spoke of victory claimed and power acknowledged. His wolf purred with approval. Their mate had survived her first battle. More than survived. She had triumphed. He found her in the infirmary, sitting on the edge of a cot, while the pack healer fussed over a wound that was already nearly closed. The sight of her blood, even the small amount that stained her torn clothing, sent a wave of murderous rage through his system that required every ounce of his control to suppress. Who? The single word contained enough menace to freeze the healer in place. Seraphina, and he found he couldn't think of her as Kira anymore, not after feeling the full force of her awakened power through their bond, looked up at his entrance. Her eyes, which had been human brown that morning, now held flecks of gold that caught the lamplight like precious metal. "Marcus Ironwood," she said calmly. "Garrett Stonewood, Alan Ravencrest. They came at sunset when they thought you would be too far away to interfere." The names hit him like individual blows, each one representing a betrayal that cut deeper than mere assassination. These weren't random criminals or foreign agents. They were sons of his own nobles, young men who had sworn oaths of loyalty and eaten at his table. "Are they alive?" he asked, though part of him hoped the answer was no. "I let them live." Her voice carried a note of something that might have been regret. "I could have killed them easily once my wolf emerged, but—" She shrugged, the gesture somehow regal despite her torn clothing and blood-stained skin. "Elena raised me better than that." Darius felt his estimation of her climb another notch. It would have been understandable, even justified, for her to exact lethal vengeance on those who had tried to murder her. The fact that she had chosen mercy spoke to a strength of character that had nothing to do with supernatural power and everything to do with the kind of person she had chosen to become. His mate was not just powerful, she was worthy. "Show me," he said softly. She didn't need to ask what he meant. The request hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond curiosity. He was asking her to trust him with her most vulnerable self, to reveal the wolf that marked her as both royal heir and destined mate. For a moment he thought she might refuse. The transformation was intimate in ways that humans rarely understood, a baring of soul as much as flesh. But then she stood, moving with the liquid grace that marked those born to shift, and nodded. The change began as golden light bleeding through her skin, starting at her heart and spreading outward like sunrise, breaking over still water. Her human form seemed to dissolve rather than break apart, bones flowing into new configurations with the ease of water finding its level. But it was her wolf that stole his breath. She was magnificent. Silver-white fur gleamed with its own inner light, marking her as a child of the moon, in ways that went beyond mere genetics. Her eyes blazed gold with royal fire, and when she looked at him, he felt his own wolf surge forward in response. The mate bond completed itself in that moment with an almost audible snap, golden threads weaving between their souls until they were no longer two separate beings, but halves of a greater whole. Every emotion, every sensation, every breath became shared between them. His wolf recognized her royal dominance and submitted with joy, dropping to its belly in acknowledgement of her superior bloodline. She was the lost princess, the rightful queen, the mate his soul had been searching for since the day he first shifted, and she was his. The realization hit them both simultaneously. Through the bond, he felt her shock mirror his own as the full implications of their connection blazed through their joined consciousness. Alpha King and Lost Princess, ruler and rightful heir. Two bloodlines that together could claim dominion over the entire northern continent. She shifted back to human form in a cascade of silver light, and he was moving before conscious thought could interfere. His arms came around her, pulling her against his chest with desperate relief, and she melted into his embrace with a sound that was half sob, half sigh. "I felt you awakening," he murmured against her hair. "Felt your power calling to mine across the miles. My wolf nearly tore free of my control trying to reach you." "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shoulder. I didn't understand what was happening, why everything felt so different, so complete. She pulled back to look at him, her golden-flecked eyes wide with wonder. Yes, like I've been incomplete my whole life and never realized it. The bond between them pulsed with shared recognition, ancient magic acknowledging what their hearts already knew. They were mates in the truest sense, not just compatible, but complementary, two halves of a greater whole that had finally found their missing piece. But even as Darius revelled in the completion of their bond, his strategic mind was already calculating the political ramifications. A mate bond between the Alpha King and the Lost Princess would reshape the entire power structure of the Northern Territories. Some would welcome it as a return to the old ways, when royal blood ruled through right of birth rather than political convenience. Others would see it as a threat to everything they had built in the 20 years since Queen Serena's death. "This changes everything," he said quietly, though whether he was speaking to her or himself wasn't clear. "I know." Her voice was steady despite the magnitude of what they were facing. "The question is, what do we do about it?" Before he could answer, Commander Thane appeared in the infirmary doorway, his weathered face grim with the kind of expression that preceded very bad news. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "we have a problem." Darius didn't release his hold on Seraphina, couldn't bring himself to step away from the warmth of her presence, when the bond between them was still so new, so fragile. "What kind of problem?" "General Blackthorne has requested an emergency council meeting. Something about concerns regarding recent security breaches and political stability." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Blackthorne was Lydia's father, commander of half the northern armies and one of the most influential nobles in the kingdom. If he was calling for emergency council, it meant the old power structure was preparing to push back against the new reality. Hard. Through their bond, Darius felt Seraphina's flash of understanding. She had spent 20 years invisible in the background of pack politics, watching and learning even when no one thought she was worth noticing. She understood what an emergency council meant as well as he did. War was coming. The only question was whether they would be strong enough to survive it. The emergency council convened at dawn, when the air still held the chill of night and the great hall felt more like a tomb than a seat of power. Seraphina stood at Darius's side, no longer hidden behind the rough garments of a servant, but clothed in the deep blue silks that marked her royal status. The moonblade hung at her hip where all could see it, ancient steel catching the torchlight and throwing it back in patterns that seemed to shift with her heartbeat. She had never felt more exposed in her life. The assembled nobles filled the hall with their presence, each one a power in their own right, each one calculating how the morning's revelations would affect their own position in the delicate web of pack politics. But it was General Blackthorne who commanded attention as he rose from his seat at the high table, his weathered face set in lines of grim determination. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded armies and expected to be obeyed. "I have called this council to address a matter of utmost urgency. Recent events have created complications that threaten the stability of our realm." Darius remained perfectly still beside her, but through their bond Seraphina could feel the tension coiling in his muscles like a spring wound too tight. His wolf was on edge, recognizing the challenge in the general's tone, even if his human mind was still processing the political implications. "Speak plainly, General," Darius commanded. "What complications?" Blackthorne gestured towards Seraphina with barely concealed disdain. "The appearance of this claimant has disrupted carefully laid plans that have taken years to develop. Your engagement to my daughter was meant to cement alliances that would secure our borders and ensure prosperity for generations. Now I'm told that arrangement is to be set aside in favour of—" He paused, as if searching for words that wouldn't constitute outright treason. "A romantic fantasy?" Murmurs rose from the assembled nobles, some supportive of the general's position, others uncertain. Seraphina could see the division forming along predictable lines: older families who had prospered under the current system versus younger nobles who might benefit from a return to traditional royal bloodline rule. "The lady is the rightful heir to the northern throne," Darius said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that preceded violence. "Her claim supersedes all other considerations." "Does it?" Lord Ironwood stepped forward, his face flushed with the kind of righteous anger that came from watching one's carefully constructed world crumble. "We have only her word and an old sword as proof. Anyone could have stolen the Moonblade during the chaos after Queen Serena's death. Anyone could claim royal birth if they were desperate enough." The accusation hung in the air like a poison cloud, and Seraphina felt the first stirrings of rage building in her chest. These people had watched her suffer for 20 years, had treated her as less than nothing, and now they dared question her identity when the truth threatened their comfort. But it was Lady Ravencrest who delivered the killing blow. "Even if her claim is legitimate," the elderly noblewoman said, her voice dripping with calculated malice, "we must consider the implications. She has been raised as a servant, educated as a commoner, trained in nothing more sophisticated than scrubbing floors. How can someone with such humble experience possibly rule alongside an Alpha King?" The words hit harder than any physical blow, precisely because they contained just enough truth to sting. Seraphina had grown up invisible and powerless, had never learned statecraft or diplomacy, or the 100 subtle skills that nobility took for granted. She was royal by blood, but common by experience. Through their bond, she felt Darius's flash of protective rage, but she squeezed his hand before he could respond. This was her fight now, her chance to prove she was more than the sum of her circumstances. "You're right," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "I was raised as a servant. I learned to scrub floors and tend fires and accept whatever scraps of kindness were thrown my way. But do you know what else I learned?" She stepped forward, moving away from Darius's protective presence to stand alone before the assembled nobility. The Moonblade pulsed with silver light at her hip, responding to the power building in her voice. "I learned what it means to go hungry so that others might eat. I learned what it feels like to be dismissed and discarded, to have your worth measured by your usefulness to those who consider themselves your betters. I learned that true strength isn't the power to command others, but the courage to endure when you have no power at all." Her eyes found Lydia in the crowd, taking in the other woman's pale face and clenched fists. "I also learned to listen when people thought I was too worthless to matter. I heard every whispered conversation, every secret deal, every plan made in the belief that servants are deaf and blind to anything beyond their duties." A ripple of unease passed through the assembled nobles as they realized the implications of her words. For 20 years they had spoken freely in front of her, never imagining that the invisible girl cleaning their weapons might be cataloguing their weaknesses and recording their betrayals. "Lord Stonewood," she said, turning toward a portly man whose face had gone ashen, "would you like to explain to the council why your house has been selling grain to our enemies across the eastern border? Or perhaps Lady Ashford would care to discuss why her correspondence with the southern rebels has been so extensive?" Gasps rose from the crowd as nobles who had thought their secrets safe found themselves exposed before their peers. But Seraphina wasn't finished. 20 years of forced silence had given her a vast store of ammunition, and she intended to use every piece of it. "General Blackthorne," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation, "your concern for political stability is touching, especially considering your secret negotiations with the coastal clans about territorial concessions that would effectively cede a quarter of our land in exchange for their military support. Support that you apparently believe will be necessary to maintain order." The general's face had gone from pale to purple, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon before common sense reminded him that drawing steel on the Alpha King's mate would be suicide. You have no proof of these accusations, he snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. Don't I? Seraphina smiled, the expression sharp enough to cut glass. 20 years of being invisible means 20 years of watching and listening and remembering. Every whispered conversation, every midnight meeting, every letter you thought was private because no one pays attention to the girl who empties the wastebaskets. She turned back to address the full council, her voice ringing with newfound authority. You question my fitness to rule because I wasn't raised in luxury and privilege, but I would argue that 20 years of living at the bottom of your hierarchy has given me something far more valuable than noble education. It's given me understanding of what it truly means to serve this realm and its people. The bond between her and Darius blazed with his fierce pride and approval, lending strength to her voice as she continued. You want to know if I'm worthy to stand beside your Alpha King? Then look at what I've survived. Look at the strength it took to endure decades of cruelty without breaking, to maintain hope when hope seemed impossible, to find the courage to embrace my heritage when it would have been safer to remain hidden. She drew the moonblade in one fluid motion, the ancient steel singing as it cleared its scabbard. Power radiated from the weapon in waves that made the air itself shimmer, and every wolf in the hall felt the call of royal blood made manifest. I am Seraphina Nightwhisper, daughter of Queen Serena, heir to the Northern Throne by right of blood and birth. But more than that, I am someone who has learned that true nobility comes not from the circumstances of your birth, but from the choices you make when those circumstances would destroy you. She raised the blade until its point caught the morning light streaming through the high windows, transforming the weapon into a beacon of silver fire. I choose to rule with the wisdom that comes from suffering, the compassion that comes from powerlessness, and the strength that comes from refusing to let cruelty define who you become. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the whisper of steel returning to its sheath. But through their bond, Seraphina could feel something shifting in the great hall. Not universal acceptance, that would take time, but the first stirrings of respect from those who had witnessed her transformation from invisible servant to queen in the space of a single speech. General Blackthorn remained unmoved, his face set in lines of stubborn resistance. But others were beginning to nod, their expressions thoughtful as they reconsidered their assumptions about worthiness and power. It wasn't victory, but it was a beginning, and sometimes a beginning was enough. The ancient castle library held secrets in its shadows, whispers of forgotten lore that had been gathering dust for centuries while the living world moved on without them. It was here that Seraphina found herself 3 days after the emergency council, drawn by an instinct she couldn't name, to search through crumbling texts and faded scrolls for answers to questions she was only beginning to understand how to ask. The mate bond with Darius had settled into a constant awareness that thrummed just beneath her consciousness, a golden thread connecting her to his presence even when they were apart. But it was more than emotional connection now. Through their link, she could sense his growing tension as political pressures mounted and the noble houses chose sides in what was rapidly becoming an undeclared war. Time was running out. The summer solstice ceremony was 8 weeks away, the deadline when tradition demanded the Alpha King either take a mate or face challenges to his authority from those who would claim his reluctance showed weakness. General Blackthorn and his allies were counting on that deadline, betting that political necessity would eventually force Darius to abandon the mate bond in favour of duty. They had underestimated what desperation could drive people to do. "Your Majesty!" The voice belonged to Scholar Aldrich, the ancient librarian whose bent frame and yellowed eyes spoke of decades spent in pursuit of knowledge that others had forgotten. He approached her reading table with careful steps, a leather-bound tome clutched in his gnarled hands. "I am not queen yet," Seraphina said gently, though part of her thrilled to hear the title spoken aloud. "Seraphina will suffice." "As you wish." The old man's eyes crinkled with something that might have been amusement. "Though I suspect that will change sooner than you think. I've brought you something that might interest you, a journal that belonged to your mother, your birth mother, Queen Serena." Seraphina's breath caught. She had hoped to find records of the old bloodlines, genealogies that might strengthen her claim or reveal weaknesses in her enemies' positions. But this was infinitely more precious. The journal was bound in midnight blue leather tooled with silver runes, its pages yellowed with age but still perfectly legible. As she opened it, her mother's handwriting seemed to leap from the parchment, elegant script that recorded not just the public history of her reign, but the private thoughts and fears that had shaped her decisions. "The wolf dreams have returned," read one entry, dated just months before Seraphina's birth. Ancient voices calling from the deep places, speaking of bloodlines and destiny and prices that must be paid in royal blood. Elena believes they are prophetic visions, warnings of what is to come. I fear she may be right. Seraphina's hands trembled as she turned the pages, absorbing fragments of her mother's inner world. Here was the woman who had ruled with wisdom and strength, reduced to human fears about the child growing in her womb and the darkness that seemed to be gathering around their kingdom. "The old magic stirs," another entry read. "Father's blood runs true in my daughter. I can feel it when she kicks, a power that makes my very bones sing with recognition. But power draws danger like a flame draws moths, and I am no longer certain we will be able to protect her when she comes into her full inheritance." "What inheritance?" Seraphina whispered, though she suspected she already knew. Scholar Aldrich settled into the chair across from her, his ancient bones creaking with the movement. "You've felt it, haven't you? The power that goes beyond simple shape-shifting, beyond the normal abilities of even royal bloodlines. Your grandmother possessed it, and her mother before her, stretching back through the centuries to the first Lunar Queen who bound the northern packs under a single crown." "What kind of power?" "The ability to speak with the spirits of the land itself, to call upon forces that predate human civilization, to wield magic that most believe is nothing more than legend." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The power to command not just wolves, but all the creatures that run wild beneath the moon. As if summoned by his words, something stirred in the deepest part of Seraphina's consciousness. Not her wolf. That familiar presence had become as natural as breathing over the past few days. This was something else, something vast and ancient and utterly inhuman that had been sleeping in her blood since birth. The temperature in the library dropped by 10 degrees in the space of a heartbeat. "She's waking up," Scholar Aldrich breathed, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fascination. "The old one, the first spirit that bound itself to your bloodline 1,000 years ago." Seraphina could feel it now, uncoiling in the spaces between her heartbeats like something made of starlight and shadow. Power that had nothing to do with physical strength or political authority. Magic that belonged to the time when the boundaries between human and animal, natural and supernatural, had been as fluid as morning mist. "Why now?" she asked, though speaking was becoming difficult as the presence grew stronger. "Because you need it," a voice said from the library doorway, and both Seraphina and the scholar turned to see Elena. Not the Elena who had raised her, but an older woman with silver-streaked hair and scars that spoke of battles fought in defence of impossible causes. "Because the darkness that killed Queen Serena is stirring again, and only the full awakening of the royal bloodline can stand against it." Seraphina's breath caught. This was Eleanor Nightwhisper, as she had truly been, not the worn-down servant who had died protecting a secret, but the elite warrior who had been chosen to guard a queen and her heir. Power radiated from her in waves that made the very air shimmer, and her eyes held depths of knowledge that came from walking between life and death. "You're dead," Seraphina said, though the words felt inadequate. "Death is more flexible than most people believe, especially for those who die in service to the royal bloodline." Eleanor's smile was sad but genuine. "I've been waiting 20 years for you to grow strong enough to receive what I have to give you." "Which is?" "The truth about who killed your mother. The truth about why the noble houses are so desperate to prevent your rise to power. And the truth about what you'll have to become to survive what's coming." Eleanor moved closer, and with each step the temperature continued to drop. Frost began forming on the leather-bound books, and Seraphina's breath misted in the suddenly frigid air. "Your mother didn't die in a random assassination," Elena continued, her voice carrying the weight of long-held secrets. "She was murdered by a cabal of noble houses who discovered she was planning to redistribute power, to return the old ways where royal bloodline took precedence over political manoeuvring. They couldn't allow that to happen. Too much of their wealth and influence depended on the current system." "Which houses?" "Blackthorn, Ironwood, Ravencrest, Ashford, 7 families in total, all united by their determination to prevent the return of true royal rule." Elena's expression hardened with remembered fury. "They hired assassins, but more than that, they hired a warlock who could corrupt the protective wards around the royal quarters. That's how the killers got close enough to strike." The ancient presence in Seraphina's blood stirred with growing anger, responding to the revelation of betrayal with a fury that belonged to older, wilder things. Power leaked from her in waves that made the scholarly tome in her hands glow with supernatural fire. "And now they're preparing to do the same thing to me. Yes, but this time they've made a crucial mistake." Eleanor's smile was sharp as winter wind. "This time you have what your mother never did, a mate bond with the Alpha King and the full awakening of powers they can't comprehend or counter." "The assassination attempts will escalate," Scholar Aldrich added, his voice tight with worry. "They'll move from accidents to direct attacks, especially now that their political pressure has failed to separate you from the Alpha King." As if summoned by their words, the mate bond blazed with sudden alarm. Through their connection, Seraphina felt Darius's shock, his rage, his desperate urgency as something threatened him directly. The library door burst open as Commander Thane stumbled inside, his uniform torn and blood streaming from a gash across his forehead. "My lady!" he gasped, struggling to remain upright. "The Alpha King! Ambush on the northern border. You have to come now. He collapsed before he could finish the sentence, but Seraphina was already moving. The ancient presence in her blood roared to full awakening, power flooding her system with the force of a dam breaking. This wasn't just an attack on Darius. It was an attack on her mate, her other half, the person whose survival had become more important than her own. They wanted to test the depth of her power. She would show them exactly what a fully awakened royal bloodline could do when the people she loved were threatened. The old one stretched and smiled, and for the first time in 1,000 years, ancient magic walked the world without restraint or mercy.